The river took the low road 3 hours before dawn, and Freya Ashgrove was already awake when it did. She had learned, in the 6 weeks since the flood drove her out of the valley, to sleep with one ear turned toward water. When the sound changed pitch outside the mill she was sheltering in, she was on her feet before she understood why she had moved at all. She was nobody here. That was the whole of her situation, stated as plainly as she could make herself state it. A refugee from a drowned valley, carrying nothing but a waterlogged pack and the clothes she stood in, arrived at the edge of a kingdom that did not know her name and had no particular reason to learn it. She had walked 3 days to reach the outskirts of Halcombe's territory, because it was the only high ground left standing within a week's walk of anywhere. She had slept in a burned-out mill for 2 nights, because it had 4 walls and half a roof, and because no one had come to tell her she could not. Her valley had gone under in a single night, the river rising faster than anyone in living memory could account for, and she had spent the week since picking her way from one temporary shelter to the next, always moving toward higher ground, always aware of exactly how little separated her present circumstances from something considerably worse. She had buried what she could of what the flood left behind, and carried what little else remained, and had grown, in the process, into someone who moved through the world expecting to be overlooked, and had made a kind of uneasy peace with that expectation. It was not bitterness exactly. It was closer to a plain accounting of facts. She had no house left standing, no family close enough to call on, and no standing in any court that might otherwise have owed her something. She had grown used to being invisible in rooms full of people who had somewhere warmer to be. She did not expect to find a king in the water. The mill sat above a bend where the old stone bridge crossed the river, and it was the sound of that bridge, a groan of timber and stone that did not belong to any storm she had ever heard, that pulled her out into the dark. She reached the bank in time to see the far span buckle and drop, and to see, in the last grey light before the water swallowed it, a rider thrown clear of his horse and pulled under by the current. She did not think about who he was. She did not think about the cold, or the fact that she had not eaten a proper meal in 3 days, or the fact that the water moving past her was full of broken timber, travelling fast enough to break bone. She went in, because a person was drowning 20 feet from where she stood, and no one else was near enough to reach him before the current finished what it had started. The water was ink-black and full of debris. It took her breath the moment it closed over her shoulders, a cold so total it felt less like temperature and more like a hand closing around her chest. She kicked toward the place she had last seen him go under, missed, surfaced, and forced herself to keep moving, instead of freezing in place the way every instinct told her to. On the second attempt, her hand closed on fabric, a sleeve, then an arm, then a shoulder far too broad and far too heavy for her to lift by any ordinary measure. He was face down against a fallen timber gate, one arm pinned beneath the wreckage, unmoving except for the current dragging at what was left of him. She got a hand under his collar and hauled, and nothing happened. She braced her boots against a submerged stone, found no purchase, tried again. On the third attempt, the water shifted the timber half an inch, enough that she could feel it give. On the fourth, using the last of whatever strength 3 days of walking and 2 nights of near starvation had left in her body, she wrenched him free. They went backward together into the shallows, both of them coughing river water onto the frozen bank, his weight pinning her legs for a long moment before she managed to drag herself out from under him. That was when she saw his eyes, gold, then human, then gold again, flickering the way a candle flickers when something is fighting to stay lit, when the wick has nearly drowned and the flame is deciding, moment to moment, whether it intends to survive. She did not know yet what that meant. She only knew a man's ribs were rising and falling too shallowly beneath her hands, and that a dark stain was spreading through the torn linen at his side that had nothing to do with the river. She pressed her palms against the wound, because it was the only thing she knew to do, And she stayed there, soaked and shaking, dragging him another 20 feet clear of the rising water, an inch at a time, until the sound of horses reached her before the riders did. The man who reached her first was broad-shouldered, grey at the temples, moving with the flat, efficient urgency of a soldier who had trained for exactly this moment and hoped never to need it. He dropped from his horse before it had fully stopped and closed the distance at a run, and then stopped dead, not at the sight of the king, but at the sight of her hands still pressed to him. "Move away from him." It was not a request. His voice had the particular calm of a man holding something enormous very still. She moved. Of course she moved. She had learned, in 6 weeks of being no one in particular anywhere she went, exactly how much space the world allowed someone like her, and it was never more than she was given permission to occupy in that exact moment. What she did not expect was the silence that followed. Not relief at finding their king alive, not gratitude toward the stranger who had pulled him from the water. Silence, heavy and strange. 3 more riders arriving and going equally still, and then the first man's voice again, quieter now, almost to himself, as though he were testing whether the words could be said aloud at all. No one has touched him like that in 289 years. She did not understand the number then. It sat in her chest like a stone she had swallowed without meaning to, foreign and unexplained, while the men lifted their king, carefully, reverently, refusing every offer she made to help carry him, and left her standing alone on the riverbank in wet clothes with the dawn coming up grey and indifferent behind her. She expected to be left there. She was not. A 5th rider, younger than the rest, was sent back for her with an expression that suggested he had drawn the short assignment and resented it only slightly less than he feared disobeying it. The castle, when she finally saw it through the mist, was larger than anything she had stood inside since the valley took her home. Grey stone walls rose 3 stories above a courtyard busy with servants and dogs, and the particular controlled chaos of a household absorbing an emergency. No one looked at her directly. Several people looked at her very carefully, while pretending not to. She was given dry clothes, plain, ill-fitting, clearly not chosen with any thought beyond function, a small fire in a small stone room, and a locked door with a guard posted outside it, which she understood immediately was not protection so much as containment. She sat by the fire for the better part of a day before anyone came to speak with her, turning the strange number over and over in her mind, unable to make it mean anything sensible. 289 years was longer than any kingdom she had ever heard named, still standing under the same house. It was longer, she suspected, than the stones of this particular castle had been mortared together. When someone finally did come, it was the same grey-templed soldier from the riverbank, standing in the doorway with his arms folded and an expression she could not fully read. "Gareth Kell," he said, "first beta to King Rurik Halcom." He said it the way a man states his rank to someone he has not decided whether to trust. "You should know what you've done before anyone else tells it to you wrong." She said nothing, because she had learned that silence generally cost less than questions. He told her anyway. The pack had a law older than the castle's foundations, older than any treaty or charter written down in any hall she had passed through that morning. No hand but a bonded mate's was permitted to touch the Alpha King during a moment of true vulnerability. Not during illness, not during injury, not in the aftermath of battle, when even kings bled and needed tending like any other wounded man. The law existed because vulnerability for an Alpha King was not merely physical. It was a door left open, and a wolf-blooded court had learned, centuries before any of them were born, exactly what could walk through an open door if the wrong hands were the ones holding it that way. A wolf caught between forms, half drowned and unable to defend himself, was a wolf who could be finished by a blade no larger than a sewing needle if the person holding him chose to use it that way instead of pulling him to safety. Not once, in 289 years, had that law been broken. Not because no opportunity had ever arisen. Kings were injured, kings grew ill, kings occasionally drowned in rivers when bridges failed beneath them, but because no one had ever been present, and desperate enough, and untrained enough in the customs of the court to know better, at the one moment when it might have mattered. Every servant, every soldier, every noble raised within a day's ride of the castle knew the law from childhood the way they knew not to touch fire. They would have stood on that riverbank and watched their king drown rather than break it, and every one of them would have called that restraint loyalty rather than cowardice. Freya had broken it without knowing it existed because she had grown up 3 days' walk from anyone who might have taught her to know better. "I didn't know," she said, when he finished. It was the first thing she had said to him since the riverbank. "I'm aware," Gareth said. "That's the only reason you're behind a locked door instead of somewhere considerably worse." He did not elaborate on what worse might have looked like, and she did not ask. He studied her for a long moment, the way a soldier studies a stretch of ground he has not yet decided is safe to cross. "For what it's worth," he added, before he left, "he'd have died on that bank in another few minutes. I've seen enough drownings to know the difference. Whatever else comes of this, you should know that much plainly." It was 3 days before anyone told her the king had survived at all beyond that first grudging admission. The wound along his ribs had been deep enough, and the cold had done enough damage on top of it, that the household's healers had spent the better part of 2 nights uncertain which way the balance would tip. She learned this in fragments from the young guard who brought her meals and who was, she came to realize, the only person in the castle willing to speak to her as though she were simply a person, rather than a category no one had a name for. His name was Oisin, and he was perhaps 17, newly assigned to castle duty, and clearly still unlearning the instinct to treat every stranger with the same wary formality the rest of the household extended to her. He told her things he probably was not supposed to tell her, because he seemed to find the silence around her situation as strange and unfair as she did. "They don't know what to do with you," he admitted, on the second evening, setting down a tray of bread and broth he had clearly enlarged beyond what her ration was meant to be. "There isn't a rule for what you did, only a rule that says it shouldn't have been possible to do it. Nobody wrote down what happens after, because nobody thought after would ever come." "That sounds like a very convenient law," Freya said, "for people who never have to be the one drowning." Oisin didn't have an answer for that, but he didn't argue with it either, and he left the door a crack open longer than strictly necessary before the guard outside noticed and made him close it. It was Oisin who told her, on the 4th day, why the flood had put the Alpha King in the river to begin with. The bridge he had been crossing had not simply failed to a storm, the way bridges sometimes did in a bad season. It had been weakened months in advance, its support timbers quietly compromised in a way that would not show until exactly the wrong amount of weight and water combined to bring it down, and someone inside the king's own court had known, with unsettling precision, exactly when he would be crossing it. She absorbed that information, the way she had absorbed most things since the flood took her valley, carefully, without trusting it fully, and without any illusion that knowing it changed her situation for the better. On the 5th day, her door opened without a guard's knock preceding it, and a woman entered whose beauty was so immediate and so calibrated that Freya understood, before a word was spoken, that she was looking at someone important. Every line of the woman's gown, every pearl worked into her hair, seemed chosen with an audience in mind, and Freya had the distinct sense of being appraised the moment the door opened, in the brief half-second before the woman's expression arranged itself into warmth. The woman introduced herself as Lady Ismay Fenmore, and her smile had the warmth of firelight and the precision of a diplomat who had never once in her adult life said anything by accident. She was, by every account, Freya had gathered in whispered fragments from Osin and from servants who did not know she was listening, the most celebrated woman in Halcom's court, beloved by the nobility, admired by the common households, credited with a decade of quiet political architecture that had kept the kingdom's fractious houses from tearing each other apart in the Alpha King's father's final difficult years. She had, by all accounts, held the court together through 2 succession disputes and a famine, and had done it with a gentleness that made her nearly impossible to resent, which Freya suspected was precisely the point of the gentleness. "You must be exhausted," Lady Fenmore said, seating herself without being invited to, in the room's only chair, leaving Freya standing. "And frightened, I imagine. It's an enormous thing what happened to you. Nobody could have prepared you for it." "I'm managing," Freya said. "Of course you are. Anyone who could do what you did on that riverbank is clearly managing a great deal more than most people twice your age." The compliment landed with the same practiced warmth as everything else about her. "I want you to know that no one blames you for what you did. You couldn't have known the law. It would be monstrous to punish an act of genuine courage simply because you didn't grow up close enough to the castle to be taught its customs." A pause, perfectly timed, long enough to let the reasonableness of it settle. "Which is precisely why I think the kindest thing for everyone, but especially for you, would be to arrange your quiet return to the refugee settlements within the week, before the court has time to decide it wants something more complicated from you than gratitude. Courts are cruel to people they don't have a category for, my dear. I would rather see you safely away before that cruelty finds its shape." Freya understood, even before Lady Fenmore finished speaking, that she was being offered a choice dressed up as a kindness, and that the alternative to accepting it had not actually been stated aloud, only implied with the same careful precision as everything else the woman said. "I'll consider it," Freya said, which was not agreement, and Lady Fenmore's smile suggested she heard the difference, and chose, for now, not to press it. "Of course," she said, rising. "Take all the time you need to consider it. I only ask that you consider it quickly." She paused at the door, and for just a moment, before she stepped through it, something in her expression cooled by several degrees. Not anger, exactly, but the flat recalculation of someone whose plans had encountered an unexpected variable. Then it was gone, replaced by the warmth again, and she was gone with it. It was after that visit, alone again, with the fire burning low, that Freya finally opened the pack she had carried out of the valley and had not properly gone through since the flood. Half buried in mud-stiffened cloth, wedged against the frame in a way that suggested it had come loose from something during the crossing, rather than having been packed there deliberately, was an iron-bound ledger, its lock still sealed with a wax stamp she did not recognize. She had no memory of taking it. She could only assume it had washed against her in the water alongside the king, and that she had shoved it into her pack without thinking, the way a person shoves anything that might matter when they have learned, through hard practice, to trust nothing that looks abandoned in moving water. She turned it over in her hands for a long while before she worked up the nerve to ask for help with it, and when she finally did, through Osin, cautiously, framing it as an idle question about an old book she'd found, the answer came back faster and stranger than she expected. The castle's archivist wanted to see it immediately. Meister Colwyn was an elderly man with thinning white hair and ink-stained fingers, and he went pale the moment the ledger was set on his table, and he saw the seal. "This belongs to the Bridge Inspector's office," he said, hands not quite steady, as he turned it under the candlelight. "It was reported destroyed in a fire 11 years ago. Officially, it does not exist. I helped file the report myself, on the word of the man who told me it had burned." He read late into that night, and later into 2 more, refusing, after the first hour, to keep her outside the room while he worked, muttering half to himself and half to her, As he cross-referenced names against a shelf of older records he seemed to know by heart. What the ledger told him, told both of them, was a plain and careful account, written in a bridge inspector's meticulous hand, of 3 separate warnings filed across 4 years about the failing supports on the very crossing that had put the Alpha King into the river. Each warning had been formally received. Each had been quietly set aside, filed under a heading that suggested routine maintenance rather than structural failure. Each bore, in the margin, the same countersignature, a court official named Master Hale, who had in recent months been observed courting Lady Ismay Fenmore's favour with unusual persistence, in what several servants had assumed was simple ambition, and no one had thought to question further. "She didn't drown him herself," Maester Colwyn said quietly, on the 3rd night, staring at the pages spread across the table, his spectacles pushed up onto his forehead where he'd forgotten them. "She didn't have to. She only had to make certain the bridge would fail exactly once, at exactly the wrong moment, and let the river do the rest. No blade, no poison, no hand anyone could ever trace back to hers. It is, I will grant her, an extraordinarily patient piece of architecture." Freya thought of the 289 years, and of a law built to keep the wrong hands away from a king at his most vulnerable, and understood, with a cold clarity that had nothing to do with the fire in the room, that the law had never anticipated a threat that arrived as water instead of a person. 289 years of guarding against hands, and no one had thought to guard against a bridge. King Rurik found her in the archive on the evening of the 6th day, still favouring the ribs she had helped save, moving more carefully than a man his size and bearing should have needed to. He found her exactly where his archivist had left her hours before, hunched over ledger pages by candlelight, matching names to dates with the same stubborn, unglamorous focus she had used to drag him out of a river. He did not thank her, not in words, not yet. He crossed the room without asking permission, the way a man moves through his own house, and sat across the table from her, and for a long while he simply watched her work in silence, his eyes, steady now, human, not flickering the way they had on the riverbank, following her hands as she turned pages. 289 years, he said finally, low, and it was you. It was not a question. She looked up anyway, because it felt like one deserved an answer. "I didn't know the law existed," she said. "If I had, you'd have let me drown," he said, and there was no accusation in it, only a kind of tired, exact honesty. That's what the law asks of everyone who knows it. That's precisely why it's never once been broken in 289 years. Everyone who might have saved me knew better than to try. My own father drowned half a league from here 40 years ago in front of 6 men who loved him, and every one of them stood on the bank and watched, because the law told them that was love, done correctly. She had no answer for that at first. "That doesn't sound like love," she said finally. "It sounds like a very old fear, dressed up in the clothes of one." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but the beginning of one, quickly reconsidered. "Perhaps," he said. "It's a distinction no one at this court has permitted themselves to make in living memory." His eyes held hers, gold catching the candle, steady, and for a moment neither of them moved. His face turned down toward hers turned up to meet it, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating off him, a breath of space between them and nothing more. The ledger forgotten on the table, the archive silent except for the low crack of the candle in its dish. Neither of them closed that last distance. Neither of them needed to. It was, she thought later, the most exposed she had felt since the riverbank, and she had not been touching him at all. He drew back first, and when he spoke again, his voice had returned to something steadier, something that sounded more like the man his court expected him to be. "Bring this to council," he said, laying his hand flat on the closed ledger. "Tomorrow, Bring all of it. I want every page read aloud, in front of everyone who signed anything, and I want to watch their faces while it happens." She understood, in that request, something she had not fully let herself believe until that moment, that he was choosing to trust the word of a nameless flood refugee over 11 years of his own court's careful architecture, on the strength of nothing more than a bridge inspector's ledger and the fact that she had gone into black water for a stranger without stopping to calculate the cost to herself. "Why trust me," she asked, "when trusting the wrong person is exactly how you ended up in that river?" He considered the question longer than she expected. "Because everyone who has ever wanted something from me has been very careful to appear as though they wanted nothing," he said at last. "You have wanted nothing from the moment you pulled me out of that water. That is either the most elaborate patience I have ever encountered, or it is simply the truth. I find, examining you across this table, that I believe it is the truth." The council convened the next morning in a great hall Freya had not yet seen, its walls lined with banners bearing a wolf's head crest in silver thread, tall arched windows admitting a flat grey winter light that left nowhere comfortable to hide an expression. Lady Fenmore did not believe, right up until the moment the ledger was opened in front of the full council, that a nameless flood refugee could undo more than a decade of patient work in a single sitting. Freya watched her face while Maester Colwyn read the first warning aloud, and watched it again while he read the counter-signature attached to it, and by the third reading the composed public smile had gone somewhere Freya suspected it rarely went in front of an audience. The counter-signatures did the work Freya could never have managed with words alone, naming names, naming dates, laying out a conspiracy 11 years in the careful, patient making, unravelling in a single grey morning in front of the one court that had never thought to look twice at the woman who had pulled a drowning king out of black water and asked for nothing at all in return. Master Hale, whose signature appeared on every dismissed warning, was removed from the hall within the hour, protesting an innocence that grew visibly thinner with every question the council put to him, until he finally admitted, under Gareth Kell's flat and patient questioning, that he had received both instruction and payment for his silence from a source he was, even then, too frightened of to name aloud. Lady Fenmore's protests that she had known nothing of it grew equally thin, until King Rurik himself asked, with the flat quiet of a man who already knew the answer, exactly how she had learned the bridge's precise schedule of use that particular week, when that schedule had been shared with no one outside his own household guard. She had no answer that satisfied the room, and the silence that followed her failure to produce one said, in the end, more than any confession could have. In the days that followed, Freya was offered a great many things by a court eager, suddenly to be seen offering them: a place in the fund established for rebuilding the flooded valley, a name restored to a household that no longer technically existed, a standing invitation to leave the castle whenever she wished, owing nothing to anyone who had briefly locked a door in front of her. She considered every offer carefully, because she had learned not to accept things without considering them, and because for the first time in 6 weeks she had the luxury of time in which to consider anything at all. Ossine, delivering what he cheerfully informed her was the last tray he'd be bringing her now that she was permitted to eat in the hall like anyone else, asked her outright whether she meant to stay or go, in the blunt way only a 17-year-old still unlearning court manners could manage. "I haven't decided," she told him, which was true in the moment she said it, and less true by the time the tray was empty. She stayed anyway, not for the castle, which she still found too large and too cold, in places the fires did not reach, not for the title no one had formally offered her, and which she was in no hurry to be given. She stayed because a king who had gone 289 years without once being touched in his worst moment had looked at her, in a candlelit archive with a stolen ledger between them, as though the law had never mattered at all, as though she had simply been the first person the pack had ever been right to let through, and he did not intend to spend the next 289 years pretending otherwise. Lady Fenmore was not executed, and she was not imprisoned in the manner of a common conspirator, because the council's evidence, however damning, proved the timber's compromise more thoroughly than it proved her hand on the tools that compromised it. She was instead stripped of her seat on the council, her lands reassigned to a cousin with no ambitions beyond good harvests, and sent to live out her remaining years in a modest holding at the kingdom's far northern border, where the winters were long and the company was thin, and no one required her particular gift for careful, patient architecture ever again. Freya thought, when she heard the sentence read, that it was perhaps a crueler fate for a woman like Ismay Fenmore than any blade would have been, to be given decades of silence in which to consider exactly how close she had come, and exactly how completely a single overlooked ledger had undone 11 years of work. Master Hale was less fortunate, and the council did not trouble itself overlong with the details of his fate, beyond confirming that he would trouble no future bridge inspectors with his signature again. In the weeks that followed, Freya found herself, without quite deciding to, taking on small tasks around the castle that no one had formally assigned her. She helped Meister Colwyn catalogue a shelf of flood-damaged records that had been sitting unsorted since the spring before last, her patience with tedious, careful work apparently well suited to his. She walked the lower town with Ossian on his rounds and learned the names of families who had lost as much to the flood as she had, and found herself, more than once, quietly directing a portion of her own new allowance toward households that reminded her too much of her own to ignore. She discovered that the castle's kitchens kept a pot of something warm going at all hours, for anyone who asked, a small kindness she had not expected from a place that had locked a door in front of her on her first night. King Rurik did not press her for an answer about her future, though she caught him watching her more than once across a hall or a courtyard with an expression she was slowly learning to read. Not the flat authority he wore for counsel, nor the careful neutrality he wore for the servants, who still did not quite know what to make of her, but something quieter, held very deliberately in check. It was Gareth Kell, of all people, who finally said plainly what the king seemed unwilling to. He found her one evening in the archive, where she had taken to spending her free hours long after Maester Colwyn had gone to bed, and set down, without comment, a small carved wooden token bearing the wolf's head crest, the kind, she had learned by then, that marked a person as under the direct protection of the crown, worn openly rather than granted in whispers behind locked doors. He had it made the day after the council session, Gareth said. He has not given it to you because he does not know how to ask what he means by giving it, and because he is, for a man who has ruled this kingdom for 9 years, remarkably poor at asking for anything he actually wants. He studied her for a moment, with the same flat assessment he'd given her on the riverbank, though the suspicion in it had long since burned away. For what it's worth, in 289 years, I have never seen him do anything the way he has done this. Make of that whatever you intend to make of it. He left before she could answer, which she suspected was deliberate. She found Rurik that night, in the same archive corridor where Gareth had left her standing with the token still in her hand, as though the first beta had known exactly where his king would be, and had arranged the meeting without either of them quite realizing they'd been arranged. Rurik stopped when he saw what she was holding, and for once, the composed authority he carried through every hall of his own castle seemed to hesitate at the threshold of the room. Gareth has an opinion about everything, he said, including matters that are not strictly his to have opinions about. He said you had it made the day after the council session. He should learn to keep castle business inside the castle. Is it true? He was quiet, long enough that she thought, briefly, he might deflect the question entirely, the way she had watched him deflect a dozen more comfortable ones across a council table. Instead, he crossed the last of the distance between them, the way he had in the archive on the 6th day, and this time there was no ledger on a table between them to explain why. 289 years, he said, and I have never once wanted anyone to keep something I gave them the way I want you to keep that. His eyes held hers, steady, gold catching the low corridor torchlight. His face turned down toward hers turned up to meet it, close enough now that she could feel the warmth of him, and nothing else stood between them but a single held breath. I am asking you to stay, not because the law requires an explanation for what you did on that riverbank, because I find 3 weeks on that I have no interest in a castle that does not have you somewhere in it. She closed her hand around the token, the wolf's head crest pressing warm into her palm, and did not step back. Gareth Kell, watching from the far end of the corridor with the particular satisfaction of a man who has spent 289 years waiting for a law to finally serve the purpose it was written for, allowed himself, at last, something that was unmistakably a smile.